Hi everyone, my name is Ben, and my capstone is titled Building a US Battery Supply Chain, Unlocking Capital to Enable Mass Electrification. I'm a dual degree student in the MBA and E-IPER programs, and I have a background in public policy, energy development, and battery materials. My advisor is Alicia Seeger, Managing Director at Stanford's Sustainable Finance Initiative and lecturer at the law school. So as many of us know, batteries are critical to the electrification and decarbonization of the transportation and power sectors. And so with mass electrification of mobility and the grid, the demand for batteries is expected to grow significantly. The problem for the US is that China dominates the battery supply chain. As you can see from these charts, the red bars here refer to China, and China dominates every sector in the supply chain, while the US is not a very big player. This is a big problem because rising geopolitical tensions have caused trade barriers to increase between the US and China. We can expect this to grow with the next administration, and this threatens the US's access to batteries. The second part of the problem is that battery plants are incredibly expensive to build. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and so even as local companies have tried to build up a domestic battery supply chain, many of them have faced a lot of struggles to find the funds to do so. And so this is the theory of change for this project. First, help local companies raise the capital to scale, which will contribute to the build-out of a domestic battery supply chain, which will in turn accelerate the electrification and decarbonization of the transportation and power sectors. So the focus is on local companies across the battery supply chain that are looking to build their first commercial plants, because this is where companies tend to struggle the most. These companies have proven out their technologies in the lab, and they're now trying to raise those few $100 million to build their first plants. To understand the best strategies to raise capital for this, I interviewed battery companies that have kind of been there, done that, or are in the midst of doing so. I also interviewed an official at the Department of Energy to understand the government's perspective in supporting these projects. So first off, here's an overview of the options that companies have in trying to raise capital for their first projects. They can borrow through private or government debt, they can raise money from different equity partners, and they can try to win government grants. So the question is, how should companies approach each pool of funding? So let's start with private debt, and I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because this really isn't an option for companies raising their first plants. And the reason is because if you take on private debt to build your first plant, it's pretty risky and can lead to bankruptcy. So first of all, banks are very unlikely to lend to you if you're building your first plant because they view these projects as way too risky. And second, even if they do lend to you, they include conditions called covenants, which can quickly bankrupt the company if certain milestones are not met. So no company that I spoke with raised private debt to build their first plants. And what about government debt? Right? So it's a great option, but it's a really difficult process. The Department of Energy's Loans Programs Office takes on more risk than banks and provides cheap debt. They also write huge checks, which is great. And if you receive a loan from the LPO, this can be seen as a stamp of approval that allows you to access cheaper capital in the future. But the diligence process is long, lasting up to 2 years, and it is extremely rigorous. So companies need a lot of outside support to navigate the entire diligence and application process. So government loans are great, but only if your tech has been de-risked, if your project plans are robust to market shifts for a few years, and if you can fund the application and diligence process. And what about equity? So financial investors here refer to the venture capitalists and growth equity investors that have funded most of Silicon Valley. But unfortunately, as you can see from this quote, an understanding of the software business doesn't quite translate to the battery space. So a lot of them have been burned over the past few years. Many of them have lost a lot of money and are now increasingly wary about the battery space. So they could still be an interesting option if your company has a distinct climate advantage. For example, if you can produce batteries in a way that produces less waste. They can also be helpful if they know the space well and if they're patient and prepared to write large checks. But if they are new to the specific sector in the battery supply chain, then it may be best to avoid them. And then we turn to strategic investors. These are companies that operate in a different part of the battery supply chain or in an adjacent sector, and they are interested to get into the battery space. So these companies know the battery space well. And because they operate in the battery industry, getting an investment from them can be seen as a strong endorsement for your company's products. Strategics are perhaps the most important source of funding, especially if they can help with offtake. They could also be a partner in building out the first plant, or they could provide complementary resources such as access to raw materials. But they should still be avoided if they want to lock a company into a customer or a certain technology early on, for example, through a mutually exclusive arrangement, or if they pose foreign entity of concern risks, meaning that the US government views their involvement as a potential national security threat. This is important to avoid, especially if you want to apply for government support in the future. Which takes me to the last segment, government grants. It's not always nice, free money. So the government has allocated large sums of grant money for the battery supply chain, and grants are great because they are non-dilutive and check sizes are large. But because they are so attractive, they're also highly competitive. There's a lengthy grant application process, and the timelines are fixed. There are also hidden costs, such as government environmental reviews, as well as requirements to hire unionized workers. And with grants, companies pay for their projects upfront before being reimbursed. And so this can cause cash flow problems for some companies. So grants are great, but you should only apply if you can beat out the competition, if your project timelines align with the grant timelines, and if project economics factor in hidden costs. And again, if you think that you'll apply for a government grant in the future, you should avoid foreign entity of concern risks early on. So what's a key risk from all of these findings? Perhaps the clearest one is the re-election of former President Donald Trump. The former president has threatened to repeal the IRA, but at the same time, he's also said that he wants to bring manufacturing back to the US. So the impact of Trump's re-election is really unclear because even if sections of the IRA are repealed, there could be stronger tariffs and anti-trade measures that he introduces. So the means may change, but the goal to build a domestic battery supply chain is likely to remain. So to summarize, when you're building a first plant, avoid private debt. Consider government debt if the application process is one that you can handle. Prioritize strategic investors over financial investors, and apply to government grants if the timelines and economics make sense for your project. So one thing that companies share that cuts across all three buckets is the importance of achieving customer commitments. Because if you can get a customer to commit to buying your product, then that could allow you to access cheaper debt, gain investor confidence, and increase the likelihood of winning government support. So prioritizing customer commitments is critical. And so what comes next? Well, sharing these findings with companies looking to build their first plant and then joining the fight. So this is a photo of me wearing a jacket from Mitrachem, which is the battery materials company that I'll be joining full-time in January. Incidentally, they're looking to build their first plant in the next few years. So hopefully I can apply the learnings from this project and my MBA and E-IPER degrees to help them in this effort. Thank you.
Great job.
Thanks.
So if you had to talk to Mitrachem and use lessons from whatever just happened at Northvolt, what would you say to them? What do you think are the takeaways from Northvolt's collapse?
Well, Northvolt is, first of all, they're not an American company, so it's a little bit different. American companies have the benefit of the IRA, so that's been really helpful. And Mitrachem did win a pretty large grant, $100 million grant award from the DOE a few months ago. So that's going to be a significant help for the company. I would say prioritize negotiations with the DOE before the next administration, which the company is doing. So if you can lock in those contract negotiations before the next administration, that kind of protects your the grant award. Aside from government support, I'd say going back to on the equity side, really focusing on strategic investors. So one of Mitrachem's biggest investors is General Motors, obviously a different part of the supply chain and a key partner. So I'd say prioritize investors that are also interested but play in a different part of the supply chain. Yeah.
Great job.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask a question more on the community side. So I know in Michigan, there was a lot of backlash to the Goshen battery plant.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that came up in sort of like community engagement or community benefits or anything like that in your conversations about building those plants in certain communities where there may be some resistance to battery plants.
Yeah, for sure. So that's something that came up during all the interviews that I did. So a key part of the strategy to building a plant is to engage communities early. Goshen's a little bit different because, again, it's a Chinese company, and some of that pushback may have had those kind of underlying geopolitical overtones. But I think if you're an American company and you go in early and you engage the communities early, which again is what Mitrochem as well as other companies have been doing, then that really short circuits a lot of the permitting and regulatory processes. Because if you can commit to creating lots of good jobs for the local communities, then they tend to be much more receptive to hosting your project. So I'd say do that early and demonstrate how you can benefit the local communities. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
So kind of following up with that, I'm curious around the life cycle aspect of batteries, right? So with all of this financing, are they also considering, especially if they're building new factories, that end, right, a cycle of a battery, especially since we know, and the beginning part, which we know has a lot of environmental impacts, and how that kind of gets put into this equation of investing and the funds needed?
Sorry, could you?
Yeah, just the question of what's the environmental impact of some of the battery production factories that are going to be going on, and how is investing considering that, right, on the front end and back end of battery life cycles?
Yeah. So on the front end, if you apply for a government grant, then you have to qualify, you have to do kind of E-IPER reviews, so government and environmental regulatory reviews. So that's definitely part of the process to ensure that the environmental impact is kept minimum. I'd say on the back end of the life cycle, a lot of grant support has also gone to battery recycling plants such as Redwood Materials, Ascend, and those are some of the players I spoke to as well. And interestingly, if you can demonstrate that you can recycle battery materials, or you can produce batteries in a kind of more efficient way that uses less materials or produces less waste products, that's actually when some of the financial investors, which would kind of avoid battery companies to begin with, that's when they may be interested because they see a kind of new angle there. So those are the projects that are actually getting a lot of support, both from investors and from the government. So I'd say it's kind of headed in the right direction there as well.